You're strapped into a cramped metal cockpit, 20,000 feet over an empty blue ocean. Ahead of you, a formation of enemy bombers is sliding into view, lining up to kill everyone on the ships behind you. Your heart rate spikes. Your hands tighten on the stick. Your thumb moves toward the trigger that controls 6 heavy machine guns in your wings. Now imagine doing all of that without the one thing every instructor told you that you needed to survive. No tracers. No glowing lines of light to show where your bullets are going. No visual feedback at all. Would you still pull the trigger? This is the story of the U.S. Navy ace who answered that question with a very calm, very deadly yes, and then proved it by shooting down 6 enemy aircraft in just 8 minutes, using less ammunition than most pilots burned up in a casual test fire. His name was Alexander Vraciu. And the choice he made about his bullets, about a tiny, invisible piece of the war, tells us a lot about skill, fear, innovation, and what it really takes to survive in the sky. Stay with this, because by the end you may never look at those bright, Hollywood tracer streaks the same way again. To understand why Alexander Vraciu ripped the tracers out of his guns, we need to start not with the bullets, but with the world he flew in. The Pacific in 1944 was not an empty map on a classroom wall. It was a living, stretching battlefield ocean as far as you could see, broken here and there by tiny islands that suddenly became the center of the world. For the United States, the plan was simple in theory and brutal in practice. Island hop across the Pacific, build airfields, get within striking distance of Japan's home islands, and crush the empire's ability to wage war. For Japan, the answer was also simple, and just as brutal. Stop those landings at all costs. By June of 1944, that collision was heading for a group of islands called the Marianas. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Take those and U.S. bombers could hit Tokyo itself. You can imagine how that sounded in Tokyo. So the Imperial Japanese Navy sent everything it could: carriers, battleships, cruisers, hundreds of aircraft to smash the American invasion fleet. The code name for their operation was a GO. The Americans had their own answer offshore, a rolling city of steel decks and flight operations. Carriers like USS Lexington and USS Enterprise, ringed by destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, all bristling with guns. And on those wide wooden decks, in the shadow of the superstructure, stood a young man from Indiana with a name most of the world had never heard: Alexander Vraciu. Have you ever noticed how the people who make history so often start out looking completely ordinary? Born in 1918 in East Chicago, Indiana, the son of Romanian immigrants, Vraciu did not grow up around airplanes. He grew up around steel mills and hard work. He studied, played sports, went to DePaul University. He thought about law. He thought about a regular career. But like so many men of his generation, the world had other plans. Aviation was transforming from a daredevil's hobby into a serious instrument of war. And in 1941, with tension building overseas, Alexander Vraciu decided he wanted in. He applied for the U.S. Navy's aviation program and earned his wings of gold in 1942. From that point on, his classroom was not a lecture hall. It was the sky. One of the most important teachers he ever had was a man whose name you might recognize: Edward Butch O'Hare. O'Hare was already a legend. He'd become the Navy's first ace and Medal of Honor recipient in World War II by single-handedly attacking a formation of Japanese bombers threatening his carrier, USS Lexington, in early 1942. He shot down several attackers and scared off the rest. If you've ever flown into O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, you've seen his legacy written on the terminal. Vraciu became O'Hare's wingman. Think for a moment about what that means. Your first real teacher in combat flying is a national hero, a man who has already survived what everybody else is still theorizing about. You watch how he scans the sky, how he uses his throttle, how he doesn't waste bullets. You watch what he does under pressure when there's no time to think. Almost everything Vraciu would later do, from how he set up his attacks to how he managed his ammunition, came from this apprenticeship. And here's where it gets interesting. Because Butch O'Hare, late in his life, was working on something unusual: night fighting. By 1943, the Japanese had begun using night raids against American carriers. O'Hare was part of a small experimental unit, sometimes called the Bat Team, that tried to intercept attackers in the dark using radar-equipped aircraft. Tracers, those bright, burning bullets that glow as they fly, were a major problem at night. They could ruin your night vision, broadcasting your position and blinding you at the moment you needed your eyes the most. O'Hare and his team reduced or eliminated tracers in their guns to stay unseen and undistracted in the blackness. Vraciu watched all of this. So even before he made his own famous decision about ammunition, the seed was planted. Sometimes what everyone thinks of as a helpful tool can turn into a liability. Sometimes light is not your friend. Keep that thought in your back pocket. We're going to come back to it. What exactly are we talking about when we say tracers? If you've seen any Hollywood war movie, you probably picture long, glowing strings of light arcing back and forth across the sky. Red and green neon rain. In reality, a tracer is just a regular bullet with a small cavity in the base filled with a burning compound. When the gun fires, that compound ignites. The bullet leaves the barrel trailing a bright streak of light that can be seen by the shooter. And by everyone else. Why use them? There are a few reasons. They show you roughly where your shots are going, so you can adjust your aim, especially useful in a three-dimensional dogfight where the target is moving in multiple directions. They let formation leaders signal to other pilots what they're shooting at. And on the ground, machine gunners can use tracers to walk, fire onto a target, and help others see their line of fire. For pilots new to combat, tracers were like training wheels. You didn't have to fully trust your instincts about range, speed, and deflection. You could look at the glowing line, see that it was a little behind the target, and correct. So the U.S. Navy loaded its fighters with belts of mixed ammunition. Regular ball, rounds, armor-piercing rounds for punching through metal, incendiary rounds for starting fires in fuel tanks and engines, and a certain proportion of tracer rounds spaced at intervals. From the ground crew's point of view, this was standardized, efficient, and safe. But there was another side. Every tracer you could see going out could also be seen coming in. Imagine for a second that you're in the cockpit of a Japanese dive bomber in 1944, hurtling toward an American carrier. You're focused on holding formation, lining up the drop. Suddenly, out of the corner of your eye, you see a chain of bright dots, like a glowing necklace, climbing up from low and behind you. It's not just one or two, it's an entire stream. You don't need to be a genius to know what that means. Someone back there is shooting at you, right now, at this angle, at this range. You yank the stick, your whole body reacting. Even if the first bursts were a little bit off, the tracers gave you a precious half-second of advance warning. That's the problem Alex Vraciu saw. In his mind, tracers weren't just helping him aim. They were helping the enemy dodge. Later in life, he would refer to them half in disgust, half in dark humor as glowing invitations. Some pilots called them Roman candles or glowing balloons. The language was different, but the feeling was the same. They looked impressive. They made for dramatic gun camera footage, but as he gained experience, Vraciu became convinced they cost kills. Now put yourself in his boots for a moment. You're in your mid-20s, and you've already been through multiple combat cruises. You've engaged Japanese fighters and bombers over the Pacific more times than you want to count. You've seen friends shot down. You've watched aircraft turn into burning comets. Every second you're in the air, you're balancing two things in your head, survival and lethality. How do I come back alive? And how do I complete the mission? You squeeze the trigger, see your tracers arc out, and watch the enemy turn away at the last instant. After the third or fourth time that happens, what are you thinking? Would you start to question the doctrine? Would you quietly wonder whether the right way to load your guns was really right? Alex Vraciu did. By early 1944, Vraciu was no longer a wide-eyed rookie. He had shot down enemy aircraft over Wake Island and later in the Marshalls. He was, by any measure, becoming an ace. In the Navy's calm, bureaucratic language, this meant he was crediting himself well. In the more direct language of the ready room, it meant, if Vraciu said something about aerial combat, you listened. He was flying the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a stout, rugged, powerful fighter with a big engine and 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns in its wings. The Hellcat had been designed almost deliberately to outfly and outfight the famous Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. It climbed better. It dove better. It absorbed punishment better. It was, as some pilots like to say, a flying tank with claws. Each of those 6 Browning guns could spit out around 800 rounds per minute. A full burst from all 6 together unleashed an avalanche of metal. But there was a catch. You didn't have unlimited ammunition. In fact, you had just a few hundred rounds per gun. Hold the trigger down for 5 seconds straight, and you could easily burn through half your supply. Many nervous or inexperienced pilots did exactly that. They'd get behind a target, mash the trigger, and blast out long, wasteful bursts that traced their way beautifully across the sky and hit very little. You might have seen something similar at a shooting range. The new guy with the automatic rifle who empties a magazine in one rattling spray, versus the old hand who fires 2 or 3 carefully aimed shots. Multiply that difference by 6 guns and 100 not relative closing speed, and you can start to understand why ammunition choice and how you used it mattered. Vraciu's style, learned under O'Hare and honed in real dogfights, was the opposite of spray and pray. He believed in getting close, very close. In one of his earlier fights, he'd closed to within just a few hundred yards of a Japanese aircraft before firing a short, precise burst that shredded the target. The closer you are, the less you have to lead, the less room there is for error, and the less language you're speaking in hope and guess, and the more you're speaking in certainty. But here's the irony. The closer you got, the more obvious your tracers became to the enemy. So for a pilot like Vraciu, disciplined, aggressive, confident in his sight, picture tracers offered almost no upside. They were like shouting, "Here I am," as you tried to sneak up on someone. So he started experimenting. We don't have a neat cinematic moment where he slammed his fist on a table and announced to the world, "No more tracers." Real life rarely works that way. What we do know is that over time he asked his ordnancemen, the sailors responsible for loading his guns, to change the mix. Less tracer, more armor-piercing incendiary. And eventually, on the mission we're working our way toward, he went all the way. M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds only. No tracers at all. What did that do? Let's talk about those M8 rounds for a second. An armor-piercing incendiary bullet was designed to do 2 jobs at once. First, punch through metal, aluminum skin, engine blocks, fuel tanks. Second, ignite whatever flammable material it encountered on the other side. So instead of relying purely on kinetic damage holes and tears, you were turning your bullets into tiny fire starters. Against an aircraft made largely of aluminum, canvas, fuel, and oil, that was a devastating combination. A burst of pure M8 didn't light up the sky on the way to the target. But when it arrived, it tended to produce a very visible, very final result. Smoke, flame, pieces flying off. From the Japanese cockpit, it could feel like being hit by ghosts. 1 second, the sky behind you is empty. The next, your wing is shattering or your engine is coughing fire. For that to work, though, the shooter had to be good. Without tracers, you lost the aiming feedback that so many pilots relied on. There was no glowing ladder of rounds stepping up toward the target, telling you, a little more lead, a little more there. You had to trust your gun sight. You had to feel closure rate in your bones. You had to judge deflection, that invisible angle between where the target is and where it will be when your bullets arrive, almost like you were throwing a football to a receiver running a route. Worth asking yourself, if you were in that cockpit, would you give up your training wheels? Would you deliberately make your job harder so that your enemy's job became impossible? Alex Vraciu decided the trade-off was worth it. And on June 19, 1944, he got to test that decision in about the most intense way imaginable. By mid-June, American forces were storming the beaches of Saipan. Japanese commanders, stunned by the speed of the U.S. advance, activated Operation A-Go. From anchorages in the Philippines, the Japanese Mobile Fleet 9 carriers and hundreds of aircraft surged east toward the Marianas. The U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance steamed west to meet them. Its fast carrier task force, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, spread out like a fan, ready to launch swarms of Hellcats and dive bombers. Historians would later call the resulting engagement the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Pilots more simply called the first day the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The label is a bit glib. It makes the fight sound like a one-sided slaughter from the start. In reality, no one on those carriers woke up thinking it would be easy. They woke up to the clang of General Quarters bells, the smell of coffee, the taste of adrenaline. On the morning of June 19th, radar pickets destroyers stationed ahead of the main fleet began to pick up incoming contacts. Large formations, multiple waves. Japanese carrier-based aircraft were on the way, loaded with bombs and torpedoes, searching for American decks to sink. On USS Lexington, pilots sprinted to their ready room and then out to the flight deck. Flight crews yanked chocks, signaled with paddles, and the long, orchestrated ballet of carrier operations spun into motion. F-6F Hellcats, each with their own stories and their own pilots, edged forward into the launch position, engines howling against the brakes. Somewhere in that line of aircraft, Alexander Vraciu sat in his cockpit, straps tight across his shoulders, engine rumbling beneath him. There were 1,000 things going through his head: his fuel load, his wingman's position, his radio frequency, his climb-out heading, and under his feet, hidden in the wings, 6 long belts of ammunition waited in the dark. No tracers, all M8 armor-piercing incendiary. You have to wonder, did he think about that in those last seconds before launch? Did he feel exposed? Or did he feel quietly confident, like a shooter who has finally tuned his equipment exactly the way he wants it? For a pilot, confidence is not a minor psychological comfort. It can be the difference between bold, aggressive action and fatal hesitation. The carrier turned into the wind. The deck crew's hands dropped. One by one, Hellcats roared forward, tail lifting, wheels leaving wood, climbing up into the hazy tropical sky. The hunt was on. Imagine you're up there now, in formation with dozens of other fighters, looking out over a horizon that seems too big for human eyes to cover. You know in some abstract sense that beyond that curved line are Japanese carriers, pilots, and bombs. But you don't see them yet. Instead, you see sunlight glinting off the ocean, broken clouds, the faint shapes of other Hellcats, maybe a contrail or two in the upper reaches. And then the radio crackles. Vector calls come in from controllers aboard the carriers, using radar plots to guide you toward the incoming waves. Bogies, bearing, turn, climb, scan. For Vraciu and his fellow pilots, the first Japanese formation they intercepted that morning consisted largely of Yokosuka D-4Y, Judy, dive bombers, fast, sleek aircraft with powerful engines and a belly full of explosives. If those Judys got through, they would dive on the American fleet and try to plant bombs on carrier decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. One lucky hit could kill hundreds of men. This was not abstract. Closing speeds in head-on-air combat can exceed 400 knots. Even in a tail chase, everything is happening faster than your conscious mind can fully process. Spots on the horizon become aircraft. Aircraft become potential kills or potential threats in a matter of moments. Vraciu and his division approached from a position of advantage higher and behind. This was exactly what they'd trained for. Now the question became, could they convert that advantage into results without wasting time or ammo? One of the most striking things about Vraciu's 6-kill mission is not just the number of aircraft he brought down, but how little ammunition he used to do it. Reports and later retellings suggest that, by the end of the fight, he'd fired dramatically fewer rounds than the typical pilot would expend in a single interception. He wasn't holding the trigger down. He was tapping it. Weapon efficiency like that doesn't happen by accident. It comes from composure, from trust in your sight. And yes, from not having your view cluttered by a distracting ladder of glowing tracer fire. As Vraciu rolled in behind the first Judy, he set up his deflection, gauged the relative motion, and fired a short burst. No neon stream, no Christmas tree of light, just the muted vibration of the guns in the wings, a brief puff of cordite smoke, and then half a heartbeat later results. The first Judy erupted in flame and broke apart. Shift target, close a bit more. Second burst. Another bomber shuddered under impacts, trailing smoke before diving. Have you ever been in the zone, doing something? Reading the flow of a sports game, or driving a road you know so well your hands move almost by themselves? Now imagine that state of mind in 3 dimensions at high speed, under mortal risk, with 6 enemy aircraft ahead of you and dozens more in the area. That's roughly where Vraciu was. He pressed attack after attack, sometimes getting so close that pieces of the disintegrating bombers flew back at him. In one case, a bomber's wing almost hit his Hellcat as it sheared off. From the cockpit of a Japanese Judy in that formation, what would you have seen? No tracers warning you beforehand. No light show letting you know an American fighter had lined you up. Just the sudden, hammering impacts of invisible rounds. One moment you're in formation, watching the tail of the aircraft ahead of you. The next, the plane behind you is spraying parts and fire, and you're yanking the stick, confused, maybe already too late. In about 8 minutes, Vraciu shot down 6 of those dive bombers. 6 enemy aircraft, each with a pilot and crew who would not live to fly another mission. 6 threats to the American fleet that would never release their bombs. 6 kills, 8 minutes. And still, most of his ammunition was unfired. When he returned to USS Lexington, the armorers counting his remaining rounds were astonished. Where other aircraft came back with their gun bays empty and barrels scorched, his still had long stretches of M8 sitting in the chutes. That cool efficiency, that absence of waste, is the most powerful argument for his choice of ammunition you'll find. He had given up the psychological comfort of tracers, and in return he had gained, or rather, fully unleashed the lethality he already possessed. Would he have done as well with a standard mixed belt? It's impossible to know. Combat is too chaotic, too full of variables. But from that day on, the legend of the ace who took the tracers out of his guns was set. Back on the carrier in the ready room, the story spread quickly. Pilots are not immune to hero worship. They're also not immune to professional curiosity. How did you do it? How close did you get? How many rounds did you use? You can almost hear the questions, the mixture of banter and seriousness. Some pilots might have looked at Vraciu and thought, I should try that. Maybe I don't need tracers either. Others might have shaken their heads and thought, that's for aces, I'm not there yet. And that tension between doctrine and personal adaptation, between standardization and individual flair, runs through the history of every military. The Navy didn't suddenly rip tracers out of every Hellcat in the fleet because one ace had a great day. Training programs didn't immediately change. For the average pilot, tracers still made sense. They provided real feedback in a chaotic environment. They could mean the difference between at least scaring an enemy away and missing entirely. But at the margins, among the very best, you began to see small acts of defiance like Vraciu's. Why? Because those pilots had something most others didn't, the ability to operate at full capacity without the crutch. Think about a professional race car driver turning off traction control because he wants the car to respond directly to his inputs. Or a sniper leaving behind a visible laser aiming device because it reveals his position. The tools that help beginners can hold back masters. Alex Vraciu's ammo choice was that principle, written in gunmetal and cordite. It's tempting, when hearing about feats like 6 kills in 8 minutes, to turn the story into an uncomplicated celebration. To make it purely about scoreboards and skill. But we should pause for a moment and acknowledge what those numbers really mean. Every one of those 6 aircraft carried men. Young men, most of them, who had also grown up with dreams and families, and who found themselves in the sky that day because of orders and causes far larger than themselves. By June 1944, Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of what it had been at Pearl Harbor. Many of its best, most experienced pilots had been killed earlier in the war. Replacements were often hastily trained, shoved into cockpits, and sent into the teeth of the Hellcats. Their courage does not erase the politics of the empire they served, nor does it excuse the atrocities that Japanese forces committed elsewhere in the Pacific. But if we're going to look at these skies honestly, we need to see every plane, not just the ones with stars and bars on the wings. Vraciu, like many aces, understood this tension. A pilot's job was to destroy enemy aircraft, full stop. But in quiet moments, the weight of what that meant could settle in. Those duties did not come home. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Alex Vraciu was a star. He was promoted, decorated with the Navy Cross, and eventually credited with 19 aerial victories and many more aircraft destroyed on the ground. Magazines and newspapers featured his story. He was pulled from combat for a publicity tour to boost morale and encourage war bond sales. Yet his war was not over. Later, in December 1944, while flying over the Philippines, Vraciu's Hellcat was brought down by anti-aircraft fire. He bilayed out and spent weeks evading capture and fighting alongside Filipino guerrillas before making his way back to American lines. It's an almost cinematic second act to his story, from lethal master of the sky to hunted man in the jungle, relying not on horsepower and guns but on stealth, endurance, and the kindness of strangers. Do you think his perspective on risk changed after that? That his memory of those long, tense days on the ground colored how he remembered the fast, hot minutes over the Philippine Sea? He survived the war, returned to the United States, built a life in peacetime, raised a family. Worked in business. Many of the young men he fought against never got that chance. When you step back and look at his career, the 6-kill mission with the exotic ammo choice is just one bright flare in a longer arc. And yet that flare tells us something important about the larger conflict. We often talk about World War II in terms of big numbers and big machines. Kilotons of bombs, thousands of tanks, fleets spanning thousands of miles. But inside those numbers were countless small decisions made by individuals. A pilot adjusting his ammo belt. A mechanic making sure that adjustment actually worked. A flight leader choosing to trust an unconventional tactic because he knew the man flying the plane. How many of those micro-decisions nudged the war's path, even slightly? Alex Vraciu's tracers, or lack of them, did not win the war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea itself, though a crushing defeat for Japanese carrier aviation, was one piece of a vast, grinding struggle. And yet, for the ships in the American fleet that day, for the sailors manning the guns and the damage control parties and the engine rooms. Each bomber that failed to break through mattered immensely. Each one less was one less column of water erupting beside a hull, one less fire on a flight deck, one less set of casualty tags filled out. 6 fewer that day owed something to invisible bullets. Let's pull the camera back even further. What does this story say about how wars are really fought not in doctrine manuals, but in the minds and hands of the people inside the machines? There's a pattern you can see if you look across history. Armies and navies develop standard procedures for very good reasons. They need to train thousands of men quickly. They need predictability and safety. They need to assume average skill levels. So they build systems around those assumptions, tracers in belts, checklists in cockpits, flags on maps. But in any system like that, there will be people on the upper right corner of the bell curve, people whose skill and calm under pressure exceed what the system was designed for. Those people will often feel friction. They'll bump up against the edges of doctrine and discover places where it doesn't quite fit them. Sometimes that friction produces dangerous arrogance. The I know better than everyone attitude that leads to reckless improvisation and tragedy. Other times, it produces thoughtful, targeted changes. The kind that quietly, incrementally, make a fighting force more effective. The tricky part for any military organization is telling the difference. In Alex Vraciu's case, his results spoke louder than any doctrinal debate could. When a man flies into one of the largest carrier battles in history, strips out a key component of his weapons system, and then produces one of the most lopsided personal victory tallies in the war, you pay attention. Does that mean every pilot should have followed his lead? No. In fact, one of the marks of a good teacher, something Vraciu later became informally for younger pilots, is knowing that what works for you at your level might not work for someone with less experience. You can almost imagine him telling a new guy, once you've got your gunnery down cold, once you trust your deflection shooting, then you can start thinking about getting rid of tracers. Until then, keep them. They'll save your life. We don't have that exact quote on record, but we do have his overall attitude, a mix of confidence in his own methods and respect for the fundamentals. And the fundamentals didn't change. The physics of deflection, the importance of closing to a good range, the need to avoid wasteful bursts. Those applied whether your bullets glowed in the air or not. What changed in his case was the signal he sent into the sky. In an age before infrared guided missiles, before radar warning receivers, before stealth coatings, one of the most revealing things you could do as a pilot was pull the trigger. Every burst of tracers was like lighting a flare, announcing, I am here. I am shooting from this angle. By turning off that flare, Vraciu bought himself fractions of a second where the enemy was still ignorant. In air combat, fractions of a second can be the difference between a clean shot and a miss, between a kill and a prolonged duel, between life and death. If you've ever played a competitive game, digital or otherwise, you know the power of denying your opponent information. The moment they know where you are, their behavior changes. Vraciu understood that instinctively years before the words electronic warfare and signature management would become buzzwords. Today, stealth aircraft are designed around that concept. Be seen as little as possible, for as short a time as possible, and only on your own terms. In a way, his invisible fire was a low-tech ancestor of that mindset. So where does that leave us, looking back across 8 decades at a young man in a cockpit, his finger on a trigger that controlled 6 very loud, very deadly Browning machine guns? It would be easy to reduce the story to a slogan. Turn off your tracers, be like Vraciu. But the deeper truth here is more nuanced. He could afford to turn them off because he had put in the work, because he had absorbed everything his mentors could teach him, because he had flown enough missions to develop an almost subconscious feel for range and angle. The bullets were invisible. The preparation was not. There's a temptation in every field to look for the trick, the one weird hack the experts use that unlocks everything. What we see in Alex Vraciu's story is that the trick only mattered because it was layered on top of a mountain of discipline, practice, and courage. Would 6 M8 loaded guns in the hands of an inexperienced pilot have changed the course of the Battle of the Philippine Sea? Almost certainly not. But in the hands of a man who had learned from the best, who had tested his ideas in smaller fights, who understood both the strengths and the risks of what he was doing, those 6 guns became something extraordinary. As you think about that, maybe ask yourself, where in your own life are you still relying on tracers? On glowing invitations that make you feel safer, but maybe also make you more predictable? Where are you spraying long, unfocused bursts, hoping something hits, when you could be closing the distance, picking your shots, trusting the skills you've built? And if you haven't built those skills yet, what would it take to start? World War II is receding further into the past each year. The men who fought it are almost all gone now. Alex Vraciu himself passed away in 2015 at the age of 96. But stories like his still have something to offer us beyond statistics and nostalgia. They remind us that behind every moment of apparent effortless brilliance lies 1,000 less visible choices. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to grab another tool, but to let one go. And that somewhere out there, on a bright June morning long ago, a young pilot looked into his ammunition bays, saw the warning bullets he didn't trust, and told the crew chief in his own plain way, "Take those out. I won't be needing them." Then he climbed into the sky, flew toward a swarm of enemy bombers, and wrote his name into the history of aerial combat with bullets you couldn't see, and results no one could ignore.